on entry. And so what that means is if you do have a question, please feel free to drop it in that Q&A section that is provided. I've got it popped out on another screen, so as they kind of come up, I'll do my best to get to them. And if I don't, we'll leave some time at the end just to make sure we go through all the questions that were asked. So yeah, perfect. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. I'm not seeing anything in the chat saying that we can't, so we're going to go ahead and just really dive in here. Quick little introduction here. Hopefully you guys are all kind of aware of the importance of backing up Microsoft 365 data since you're here. But just as a quick refresher, it really comes down to that shared responsibility model with your M365 data. And what that really means is that while the infrastructure components, all of the applications and things like that are handled by Microsoft, when it comes to your actual data, you guys are the ones that are in charge of keeping that protected, as well as, you know, having it backed up and different things like that. And that's really where Veeam comes in. So as you can kind of see here, we've got a lot of different things that we can do with this product as far as protecting that data, whether it is, you know, protecting it from accidental deletion or from retention policy gaps or any number of reasons that you might want to have this data backed up and protected. And we can do it on whatever schedule you guys really want, whatever fits within that recovery point objective that you have for this M365 data, whether it's, you know, backing up weekly or even down to every 5 minutes. And of course, we really want you to be able to take full control of that data. And so because of that, we allow you to really store this data anywhere that you want, whether that's in on-premises storage or whether it's going to some cloud-based object storage, something like an S3 bucket or Azure Blob. As we dive in, we'll talk about all of the different options for where this data can land so that you can take full control over it. Of course, that's really half the story. The other half is obviously being able to recover what you guys have backed up and also finding that data to be able to recover it. So we do give you over 40 ways to be able to restore that Office 365 or Microsoft 365 data, whether it's on the email level, whether it's more global than that, like SharePoint sites or mailboxes or OneDrive, as well as, you know, granular again with those documents and libraries and lists and different things from within all of the different applications that we're able to protect using this data. And of course, being able to find it is something that's very important, whether it's for, you know, legal or compliance requirements or just finding that deleted email that you need to recover. We give you powerful e-discovery tools to be able to do that. All of that you guys will be able to see in the demo, and as we dive in, we'll go over some of the best practices. Really what we're going to be covering today is a lot on architecture overview, whether it's what architecture Veeam needs in place or how we fit into your architecture that you already have in place. And alongside that, going over some design and sizing tips and tricks here to make sure that you're getting set off on the right foot. And so we'll definitely be touching on how to optimize the environment as well. It's not necessarily going to be a linear thing. We're definitely going to jump into a demo, so we'll touch on all three of these throughout and make sure that as you guys either set up this environment or try to fine-tune your environment that you already have set up, that we are really optimized to be able to back up your M365 data successfully and in the exact way that you guys are hoping to be able to do. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the demo here. I'll pull up our lab environment and look in at our product for backing up M365. This is Veeam's backup for Microsoft 365 right here. If you guys are familiar with our backup and replication console, this one looks and functions fairly similarly, so there shouldn't be too big of a learning curve for those of you that are already utilizing that. But we also tried to make it fairly simple and user-friendly as well. So if you're not using any of our other products, hopefully the learning curve shouldn't be too difficult. Now, as we kind of jump in, I like to start out with the actual infrastructure of Veeam because this goes into how we can actually architect the solution. What we're looking at now, obviously, is the Veeam console, and that really lives on what we call the backup, the backup server. Now, this backup server is really the control panel for everything involved in our backup solution here, whether it's keeping track of our different storage repositories or our data movers in these backup proxies, as well as where we're authenticating with your organization or tying into your organization and running our backup jobs. And it's also where we can go to do some of our different restores. Now, there are a couple different ways that we can do restores, and we'll definitely touch on those later. But traditionally, it has been done here on the backup server. So the backup server is really acting as the control panel for everything. It does need to be a Windows-based server. Now, that doesn't, we're not really defining exactly where you need that to be. That's going to be something that we'll take into consideration as we're architecting. This can be a virtual machine. It can be a physical machine as well, a well-powered workstation. Or if we wanted to keep it completely cloud-based, we could do a Windows-based virtual machine in somewhere like an Azure or in an EC2 instance in AWS, both of which we have some pre-configured machines in those two different marketplaces, being Azure and AWS, to help you kind of get started. So the first thing when we're thinking about architecting is where do we want to put the backup server? Now, the other two parts of the infrastructure will really play a big role in how are we actually architecting this out. So I'll go over those real quick, and then we can talk about how do we want to think about data flow for backup as well as restore, so that we know exactly where we want to deploy. As far as data movers go, we're going to be using something called backup proxies here. They'll do a little bit of compression as we back up, but their main purpose here is really moving data from production into storage wherever you decide for it to be. Now, you can see in our lab environment here, we've got a default backup a default backup proxy rather. And that's embedded on the backup server. So as you're installing, you'll already have one backup proxy that you can use. Now, depending on how you size out the backup server, this default backup proxy can handle quite a few different users. Even with our minimum requirements, this should be able to handle about 500 objects here, whether they're different users, they're Microsoft Teams channels, or even SharePoint sites. Right around 500, give or take a few, with that default proxy in its minimum requirements. Now, if we need to back up more users, we can give more than the minimum requirements to this backup server to make the default backup proxy be able to handle more of those different objects. Or we can also add additional proxies to balance the load a little bit, so that we're not all pulling data all from one appliance here. So those are going to be our data movers. They'll play a big role in how we architect the solution. And then finally is our backup repositories. Now, these are really just how we talk about storage for your backups. You can see we've got quite a few different options here. Now, I mentioned this can be wherever you would like it to be, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. With on-prem, there are a few limitations I did want to kind of point out to you as you're kind of planning out your environment here. So when we're doing on-prem storage, we're going to pick a path to local storage, and that is exactly where your data is actually going to live. When we talk about doing object storage, you'll be able to offload to object storage as well, directly there. But when we're doing on-prem, we're just going to leave this page blank here, and this will become our actual repository. Now, I mentioned there are a few limitations here. Direct attached storage, there aren't really any limitations there. We can absolutely target that. If we did want to target a SAN as our repository here, we do need it to be connected to the backup server, whether physically or through a virtual HPA or iSCSI, something like that, to be able to present it to the backup server and use it as a target. And with NAS devices, we do need it to be SMB shares rather than NFS shares, and those need to be SMB 3.0 or newer. It has to do with the type of JetBlue databases that we're actually writing data on. NFS is unable to handle those, so we do need it to be an SMB share in that way. One thing you'll notice I did not mention was deduplicating appliances. With this product in particular, again, because of those live databases, we're not able to target those deduplicating appliances for your backup target there. So those are kind of the limitations and things to think about if you want the data to land on-prem. Now, of course, if we're going to have the data land on-prem, it makes a lot of sense to have the backup server itself also be on-prem just for data flow purposes there. So that kind of deployment tends to be a little bit easier to figure out. Now, if we did want to go to something like an Azure Blob container here, we can do that directly. You'll notice we're still going to have a path to local storage. And that's going to be for metadata. So it's usually about 1 to 5% of your actual backed up data is going to be the size of that metadata. It's really these pointer files that are going to let us know where in object storage the data actually lives. Helps us out a lot when we're going to do different restores, as well as helps out with some ingress and egress charges as well. So definitely an important piece there. And you'll also notice that we are tying it to a backup proxy. I'll come back to that in a second here, but what you'll notice is if we do want data to go directly to that object storage, while we are going to leave some metadata behind, if we select to offload the data to object storage here, that is where your actual data will land as far as the backups go themselves. So in this case, we used an Azure Blob container, but we have quite a few object storage vendors that we work with, whether it's one of the big guys like AWS, like IBM, like Azure, or some of our S3 compatible object storage vendors. I think we have about 30 that we work with. Any of those are options as a repository here with this product. So as you're thinking about it, those are some things to keep in mind. One thing you'll notice is here we do have the ability to encrypt at rest in object storage. If you want Veeam to handle that encryption, which is AES 256-bit encryption, the data does need to go to object storage. Now, if we're going to have the data land on-prem on that path to local storage here, and we want it to be encrypted, we can do that on the back end through like some volume level encryption or something like that. So Veeam won't handle it, but it is able to be encrypted if you're needing to do it in that way as well. So I mentioned we come back to this backup proxy. This backup proxy is where all of the data flows through as we're actually running backups. So the position of this backup proxy is really the key in where do we want to deploy our backup server here. I said on-prem, it makes a lot of sense to have the backup server on-prem, but if we're sending that data to object storage, there are some considerations there. If we deploy the Veeam backup server on-prem, we know that this proxy here is attached to the backup server. So in that case, we're actually going to be pulling data down from Microsoft 365 through our data center, through the backup proxy, and then sending it back out to something like an Azure Blob or something like that in the cloud. So from a data flow perspective, this may not make sense. You may have the compute, you may have the network to be able to handle this. You can absolutely have your backup server on-prem if you're sending the data to object storage. But a lot of times what we see is we'll actually have the backup server deployed in a cloud-based instance. Just remembering it does need to be a Windows-based server in the cloud there. And the reason for that is our backup proxy then is going to be in the cloud as well. So in that case, we don't have any data flowing through our data center. We're keeping it completely cloud-based. So in that way, we can just kind of go through our proxy in the cloud and send it out to our Azure Blob container in that way. So just a few things to consider as you're thinking about how to deploy and architect your solution or this solution in your environment there. Hopefully those were some helpful tips and tricks. One other thing I want to point out as we're kind of going through the storage, this is where our retention policy is set up. So you can see we do have some preset retention policies going all the way up to keep forever if we wanted to. We can also specify a number of days. So we're really the goal here is holding on to data for as long as you want, definitely trying to get past those Microsoft retention policies, but beyond that, for any specific compliance needs or just retention policies that you guys have set up in your environment, we want you to be able to hold on to the data for however long you need to. Now, one thing you'll notice is there are two different types of retention policies, so I'll definitely go into those here now. The snapshot-based retention is very similar to what you're probably used to with backups. It's going to be that point-in-time backup. So, for instance, we would run a backup today, and then everything in that point in time that we've backed up is going to be held on to for the entirety of the retention policy in storage. So if we backed up today and had a 1-year retention policy, that data will be held onto in whatever repository you're sending it to for a full 1 year. With item level retention, it works a little bit differently. It's based on the last modification date or creation of different objects here. So it's a lot more granular with how we actually apply the retention policy. It works really great for specific compliance needs, things like a HIPAA or different things like that. So what we would do here, if we had a 1-year retention policy, we're still going to do that point in time backup, but we're going to take into account the actual last modification date or creation date of each individual item. So if we're backing up a mailbox today and that mailbox has an email that's already 11 months old, well then in storage, we're just going to hold on to it for 1 additional month. That way the full retention of that object is 1 year. So it's definitely more granular. It works really well for those specific compliance needs. The reason I point these out is the type of retention policy that we apply is not able to be changed after the fact. You'd have to create a new repository to change the way you're retaining information. So it's definitely something that you want to have a discussion about before you finish deploying the repository so that your retention is exactly what you want it to be as you're moving forward. Now, the time period can be changed after the fact, so if you need to extend it a little bit further down the line, there's no problem doing that. Just the retention type cannot be changed there. Perfect. So that's our infrastructure and a couple tips and tricks for how we would actually want to deploy and set up for data flow. Now, the only other thing that we would need to do to set up is add in your organization. Now, this is where we're really starting to connect into your organization and see what type of data we're actually going to protect, as well as how we're going to authenticate. So you can see here we've got M365 set up right now. That means we're just grabbing data directly from the M365 cloud, but we can do hybrid approach or even just your on-premises data with that Exchange Online, but also the Exchange server as well as the SharePoint server. So just depending on what your environment looks like, we're able to back all of those up. And then, of course, we're able to pick what types of, which of the applications we do want to protect, whether it's Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, or Teams, or all of the above. Now, of course, this is not actually setting up our backup job. It really is helping us know what type of authentication we're going to use, what type of, or rather, what type of permissions we're going to use as we're doing our authentication there. So that leads us to the authentication. You can see that we do have the ability to authenticate with whatever type of authentication you're using in M365. So if you're on modern authentication, Veeam will register an application in Azure AD for you and use that certificate-based authentication, but we can also do basic authentication as well, where we're really doing it more on behalf of an actual user to authenticate with. Now, either way that we do this, we do recommend using some sort of service account as the credentials that we're going to use. So as we're registering that application, we will be prompted to log in with a user that has the ability to register applications and has admin credentials of at least SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and Exchange if you wanted to go with the least principles, or you can use a global admin, but we don't necessarily recommend that. Same thing with the basic authentication. You'll see you're prompted to utilize a username and password. So we definitely recommend using a service account for this authentication process. But either way, we'll follow the wizard and Veeam will do a lot of the work for you. So if we're registering an application, you can see Veeam will register that for you, as well as generate that self-signed certificate for you, at which point you'll just have to copy a code and follow a link and give it that admin credential that has the ability to register applications and has the admin permissions that you are most comfortable with using for this, as long as they fit our least privileges principle there. Same kind of thing if we're doing the basic authentication. In that case, we're really just just giving it that username and that password, and Veeam will connect and do the rest for you. Either way you do that, once you've kind of gone through the wizard, Veeam will connect into your organization for you, and you should be able to see it right here in your console, so you know that you're ready to go ahead and start kicking off backup jobs. I'm going to pause here for a second because I do see that there's a question. So it says, do the different retention policies back the backup or restore overhead, the time, server resources, or usage, etc.? So they potentially could, but for both of these options, if I kind of jump in, more on the kind of actually during the backup, setting up that retention or actually applying the retention policy itself, you do have full control over how often we're scanning the backups to actually apply that retention policy. So for both of them, the overhead tends to be about the same. Now, where we see some differences is potentially with storage consumption. Obviously, if we are backing up for a certain amount of time rather than keeping forever, we tend to see that snapshot-based retention has a little bit more data in storage just because we're holding on to everything for the same amount of time and not really applying that retention policy as frequently. So hopefully that answers your question there. Now, as we're diving in, like I said, under your organization here, this is where we're really going to be handling everything. So whether it's doing different restores or creating and editing different jobs, all going to be under your organization here. I'm going to edit a job that's already been created just for time savings, but you can create multiple jobs per organization. It's not just limited to the one. Obviously, we're going to give it a name, but then we get to decide the scope of exactly what we're backing up. So we can back up the entire organization in one go, and based on what you decided to protect, whether it's all of the applications or just certain ones, we're going to back up all of that data from the applications that you chose in your organization, all on the same schedule, all with the same repository, and all with the same retention policy. So you can absolutely do that. But we do sometimes recommend actually splitting up your backups. You can do that in a few different ways and for a few different reasons. So you can kind of see we can back up the following objects, whether it's specific users, specific groups, sites, or teams as well. So as we do these different things, we can get more and more granular with what we're backing up. So for instance, if we wanted to split things up based on different applications, we might grab specific users or specific groups here, and under that user we can say, hey, we are just doing our Exchange backup this time, so we're going to grab mail and archive. Or if we just know that, hey, we're grabbing specific users but we don't have a personal SharePoint site, we can just say, hey, we're going to grab OneDrive, archive, and mail data for this particular user. Now, if you do it that way and you do still want to be able to back up those specific company-wide sites or your team's channels, you can always go in and add those as an object as part of your backup as well. So a couple reasons we see these split up, like I said, maybe keeping your different applications separate in the backup. For instance, maybe you want your SharePoint data to go to one repository and your Exchange data to go to another. You can absolutely do that. Or maybe you're doing it because you've got different retention policies for different groups. You can absolutely split it up by different groups, send them to different repositories that have their own separate retention policies, and make sure that you're adhering to your compliance standards in that way. And then finally, maybe we've got something like C-suite employees that are needing to be backed up more frequently than other employees, where you can absolutely have a separate job just for them and set up their schedule slightly differently than the other users in your environment. So a lot of different reasons we might want to split these up. Also, if we're just talking about a large amount of data, it may just make sense to split them up to have smaller backups and actually have shorter windows for the backup and kind of run them, stacked up against each other. So SharePoint first and then Exchange, etc. So a lot of different reasons we might want to split these up. Now, if we do the entire organization, maybe we only have a few users we don't want to back up, we can always go in and actually exclude those users, groups, or sites or teams from the backup as well. So full control over what you're wanting to back up, just depending on the reason that you would like to. And then finally, we're going to be pointing to the repository that we want to go to, as well as setting up that schedule. So I mentioned earlier, we can back up every 5 minutes if we wanted to. We also see a lot of people doing like a nightly backup or something like that. So whatever your recovery point objective is, we can definitely tailor your backups to make sure that we're backing up on the frequency that you would need to be. All right, we're going to jump into an Exchange actually, I'm going to jump into a SharePoint restore because I'm going to show you Exchange in a different way here. All of these guys are split up into their applications, like I said, but they're also split up to the latest point in time, or you can roll back to a previous point in time to look through that if you wanted to. I'm going to pull up the latest point in time here, and this one's SharePoint. So you can kind of see all of our different all of our different explorers are going to look fairly similar. So they'll pop out like this. You will see all of the different objects that we've actually backed up from within these guys. And then the restore options are going to be fairly similar. Now, there are some differences between the different applications, but they are fairly similar. They all follow just about the same kind of process here. I'm going to open up our community site as an example. So you can see within SharePoint, we can back up, the full site as well as any subsites that you have in there, as well as your content. So if we're talking about having different lists or different libraries, things like that are all able to be backed up as part of this backup job. And as we drill down a little bit further, we can always find more specific things that we need to recover. Now we can go from global to very granular. So if we needed to restore the entire site, it is migratable at this point. So now we can restore the SharePoint site, the full site, directly back to where it came from, or we can migrate it elsewhere if we needed to for whatever reason. Everything underneath is going to follow that same process. So if we've got any subsites in our lab, we don't. But if we did, we could restore those, across different sites or back to where they originally came from. And then as we drill down, obviously we can get more and more granular with Exchange, with SharePoint and with Teams and with OneDrive. We're always going to keep track of version history as well. So as we do these, you can see we have the ability to view the history. Now there's not going to be any in this lab because as you can see, there's just one version. But if you needed to roll back to a previous version, you can always do that. The restore options are going to be the same. And like I said, they're always going to follow the same kind of principles of being able to restore it directly back to where it came from, as well as restoring it to a new location, migrating it elsewhere. We also have the ability just to export as the type of file that it is. So in this case, a PNG, can do MSGs or PST files, as well as any other type of files that we have within Teams, OneDrive, or SharePoint as well. And then you will always have the option just to send whatever item we're trying to restore, directly to someone via email as well. So whatever fits your needs most there, you'll have the capabilities of doing those things. Now they're all pretty similar between OneDrive, Teams, and SharePoint here. I'm going to show you Exchange in a slightly different way. This is something that's newer for version 6. We do have the ability to set up self-service restore portals, and you can create these for any of your individual users, or you can create them just to delegate to a few different people who can handle restores for whatever you set up. So in this case, we're looking at one where Jon Snow is able to only restore his own data, but you can set it up where Jon Snow can do all of the SharePoint